Jill tonight is going to talk to us about Sir Magnus Donners. Always, I think many of us have probably always felt he's a somewhat ambivalent character, and yet he's surprisingly central to the dance narrative, I think. Okay, so Jill, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank
Jill's
you.
been a member for many years. But beyond that, I'm going to suggest, Jill, you start off by introducing yourself.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Keith. So my name's Gill Bennett, a member of the Society, a long-time reader of dance and indeed the other novels, but I've been reading and rereading dance for about 50 years, which is about the same time as I've actually worked. I'm a professional historian. I spent nearly all my career working within the British government. I specialise in the history of secret intelligence, but also British foreign policy. That doesn't necessarily colour very much what I'm going to say about Donners, though, as you will hear, it does come into it. So I've chosen Donners, not because I particularly like him, but actually, as Keith said, because he's an enigmatic figure. And in fact, I think that Powell goes out of his way to make Donners an unattractive figure. But he's very important. He appears in every single volume of Dance. And he exudes a kind of latent power that makes him very interesting to me. Now, of course, he's more present in some of the volumes than others, in particular in Bias Market, The Kindly Ones, and The Valley of Bones. But even in those volumes where he only appears incidentally, both he and indeed Starwater serve a very important purpose in terms of plot and character development. And as I say, I have a professional interest as a historian in the kind of person that Donners represented in real life and how his life relates to events at the time when he lived. I'm going to divide my talk roughly into three sections. Firstly, what was Donners like? What do we get from Dance, both physically and in terms of his character? Secondly, a little bit of history reflecting on the kind of contemporary figure that Donners represented and occasions when his story seems to intersect with real life. And finally, the role that the character of Donners, his business interests, and indeed Starwater fulfill in the sequence of novels as a kind of portal to certain important plot developments and to significant characters. So let's start with what was Donners like. Now, I've put that picture of Richard Pascoe up because I gather he played Donners in the television series. I have to admit, I did not watch this. I'm sure other people have this too. I have a very strong mental picture of what the characters in Dance look like, and I don't really want to see something different. So I didn't actually watch it, but there you are. For those who did, there was Richard Pascoe. Now, what was he like? Although he is talked about in Question of Upbringing, we don't encounter him in person until the mid-1920s at Mrs. Andreadis's party in the Buyers Market. There he's said to be in his mid-50s, which puts him at being born in the mid-1870s. As for the date when he died, according to Books Do Furnish a Room, it's 1946, when he would have been about 70, but both Temporary Kings and Hearing Secret Harmonies imply he died in the early 1950s. And to some extent, I think this uncertainty is deliberate. It's part of the way Jenkins or Powell keep Donners deliberately ambivalent, as Keith said. So I think that's... Another key feature is that Donners always has female companions in the wings. He doesn't actually marry until his wartime marriage with Matilda after the disintegration of her marriage with Morland. And as Jenkins comments, perhaps with a touch of envy, Donners, quote, has built up a huge fortune, risen to all but the highest peaks in politics, appreciates the arts in a coarse but perfectly genuine manner, and always has a succession of pretty girls in tow. So I'm actually going to quote the first description, physical description from Buyer's Market, because elements with it are repeated again and again throughout Dance. So I'm quoting here, clean shaven, good looking rather than the reverse. Possibly there's something odd, even a trifle disturbing about the set of his mouth, something that perhaps conveyed interior ferment kept in severe repression. Apart from that, his features been reduced, no doubt by laborious mental discipline, to a state of almost unnatural ordinariness. He possessed, however, a suggestion about him that was decidedly parsonic, a lay reader or clerical headmaster, even some distinguished athlete of almost uncomfortably rigid moral convictions, of whose good work at the boys' club in some East End settlement his own close friends were quite unaware. He seemed indeed too used to the open air to be altogether at ease in evening clothes, which were carelessly worn, as if only assumed under protest. Nevertheless, his heavy, purposeful walk implied that professional politician. A touch of sadness about his face was not unprepossessing. Now, with this description, which incidentally, there's aspects of it, it reminds me of pictures of Clement Attlee, but that's not a close resemblance. Jenkins creates quite a powerful image of Donners, outwardly the successful businessman, but rather enigmatic. And his demeanour is to Jenkins outwardly inconsistent with what Jenkins imagines such a man would look like. So I regard this passage as a very important foundation in Donner's progression through dance. It establishes from the start his persona as a kind of puritanical but repressed character who uses power to gratify unspecified urges. From now on, whenever Donners crops up, we have this mental image of an outwardly mild but forceful figure whom Jenkins, to his frustration, never quite gets to the bottom of. Though he's forced to admit that Donners was, as he put it, an unusual person who, even within his own terms of reference, had lived an unusual life. We get another fairly full description in the kindly ones. I won't read it all out. During the crucial episode at Stourwater at the time of the Munich crisis in 1938. By this time, Donners is in his early 60s, and Jenkins says 10 years have left little mark on him, though he does note later on, during the war, when he's working with General Lidderment, that the two men are rather similar. And the final full description comes in the Valley of Bones, when Jenkins then meets Donners and Matilda at an embassy party in the summer of 1945. Now, Donners would be about 70. He had, says Jenkins, quote, grown not so much older in appearance as less like a human being. He now resembled an animated tailor's dummy, one designed to recommend second-hand, though immensely discreet clothes. Jenkins thinks he now looks less like a clerical headmaster and has probably branched off from this interior priestly strain in his makeup. I mean, he's fairly censorious always about Donners. He's critical throughout. And I think it is notable that Donners, unlike other older men portrayed in dance who have a recurring role, Donners is never given the redeeming features or eccentric features of personal magnetism or humour that Powell portrays sympathetically in figures like Uncle Giles or Edgar Deacon, General Conyers, or even the sinister Dr. Trelawney. However bizarre those people or their behaviour may be, Jenkins clearly likes them. But references to Donner's rumoured sexual preferences or peccadillos, rather than regarding them as intriguing glimpses into his character, Jenkins is very censorious of them. So it contrasts with how he talks about, for example, Uncle Giles's supposed relationships with various women, including, of course, Mrs. Eardley. So this leads us on, really, from Donner's physical appearance into his character. Nearly every reference emphasises Jenkins' alienation from Donners and his underlying distaste for him, even while admitting reluctantly a certain amount of personal presence and certainly material and political power. Throughout Dance, Jenkins worries away at what does he really think about Donners, expressing surprise that he's a recurrent figure in his life. And that, again, is in contrast to other figures where Jenkins seemed to accept that certain people are going to come up again and again. From the very first mention, we sense that Jenkins, and perhaps Powell, I would argue, find Donners, or the kind of man Donners was, antipathetic. The world of business and politics in which neither Jenkins nor, I think, Powell really has much interest. In fact, I do think we can, to some extent, take Jenkins's views of Donners as representative of what Powell himself felt of that kind of person. When he meets Donners for the first time, Jenkins admits that his previous mental image of him is not quite what he expected, but he still finds everything about him enigmatic and somehow unattractive. Donners is also boring, even if he has to accept that he keeps coming back. As dance progresses, the emphasis is always on Donners' dullness, even while acknowledging his power. Morland is made to say that he's bored of Donners and wants to hear no more about it. Quote, I recognise Donners has his points, has in the past even been very obliging to me. The fact remains that when I did the incidental music for that film of his, I saw enough of him to last a lifetime. And earlier, Stringer was also refers to how boring Donners was, and clearly Jenkins agrees with that, describing the impression when Donners speaks as intensely dull. Colourless phrases were produced with difficulty, hesitancy, simulated, nevertheless effective, a vast capacity for imposing boredom, a sense of immensely powerful stuffiness. You get the message. And yet, throughout Dance, Jenkins returns constantly to Donners, musing on the apparent contrast between his wealth, power, and influence, and his boring, withdrawn, and apparently colourless character that Jenkins realised is not quite right. The question of Donners' supposed sexual preferences, i.e. voyeurism, is a persistent theme until his eventual marriage with Matilda anyway. Perhaps it's a way of trying to humanise Donners, but I'm not really convinced by that. I think it also is to emphasise those aspects of Donners that the narrator finds ridiculous. We learn detail about this from, for example, when Matilda explains to Jenkins at the party at Stringham's mother's house after the performance of Morland's symphony in Casanova's Chinese restaurant. Matilda explains how she met Donners and how they got together. And she does call him drab. She said, I got tired of him for other reasons. He can be nice in his own way. He is awful, of course, at times, really awful. But he is generous, says Matilda, morally generous too. She says she's not interested in money and that Donners does know what jealousy is. He doesn't actually care if his women knock about with other men. Jenkins admits he would like to have asked Matilda a lot more about this. He clearly would like more detail, but he doesn't feel he can. It's too much of a sore subject between Matilda and Morland, Matilda's own past with Donners. And the other reference I just want to mention is, of course, this bracketing of Donners' supposed preferences with those of Whitmerpool, who later on is supposed to have been watching his wife Pamela in bed with Ferron Seneschal and maybe others. And of course, in Temporary Kings, Pamela Whitmerpool brings this up at the dinner party in Jackie Bragadin's palazzo, where she talks about Donners as a voyeur, in reference to Tiepolo's ceiling, the scene of Candelais and Gyges. Jenkins says this shows imagination on Pamela's part, but actually I think from what we learn about Pamela in the series, it's certainly the sort of information she would have gone out of her way to get hold of. Now, I'm not going to list all the references to Donners' supposed sexual habits, other than to note that Jenkins does say in The Kindly Ones that he and Isabel used to discuss in private whether Matilda always referred to Donners as Donners, even when they were in their most closest intimacy. Still, Nick recognises that all Donners' behaviour is rooted in what he calls a power element. quote, the principle could clearly be extended from mere social occasion to one with intimate overtones. The power element in both uses is obvious enough. The practices attributed to him, justly or not, had to be admitted as inescapably grotesque. Humour never more patently the enemy of sex, which really sums up what I would say, the distaste that Jenkins really feels for Donners, rather unfairly, I think, because Donners actually never does anything to Jenkins or really impinges on him very much at all in a personal sense. But Jenkins worries away at it all the time. So we're going to move on to just a little bit of history. Don't worry, there won't be too much of this. As I've indicated, Donners represents a side of life, business, politics, that is very little interest to Jenkins in dance. But based on the detail, we can just speculate a little bit about the kind of real life figure that Donners may have represented. We learn in Question of Upbringing that he'd been an MP during the First World War and just after, but now in the early 1920s, he's out of Parliament. There's a hint at Sillery's Tea Party that he might get a peerage, but that's never followed up. This means he could very well be one of the men described by Stanley Baldwin there as a lot of hard-faced men who look as if they've done very well out of the war. This remark was quoted by Keynes, the economist, in The Economic Consequences of the Peace, referring to the atmosphere in Parliament when the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, was about to go off to the peace conference in 1919. Keynes was really referring to members of the coalition government as people who pledged themselves to make a lot of money out of the reparations settlement. Now, we never learn whether Donners held any kind of ministerial post in the government, but the implication is he lost his seat, like many others, in the election of 1922. That might have been the 23 election, that's not clear. But from now on, Donners concentrates on business. We hear quite a lot about Donners Brebner, his company, concentrating on dealing in metals, steel and chromite, all, of course, commodities that are going to become very important to British rearmament during the 1930s after the Depression, sort of 29 to 32, when there was a slump. Clearly, in real life, there were a lot of companies in this position. There are some references, a reference in Books Do Furnish a Room and again in Hearing Secret Harmonies about Donners possibly having media interests, press interests. He's spoken of as being a rival to Rosie Manash's former husband, Jock Udall, but there's no detail about he may have had media interests. That's not explained. We get more information on what he's up to in the 30s. From various information given to Jenkins by Roddy Cutts, by Fetty Place Jones. They're all talking of Donners as the coming man and that he's making a lot of money and that he's kind of, Cutts says Donners is, quote, in close touch with some of the seedy businessmen, one or two of the cabinet cultivating. He's alleged to be absolutely out of sympathy with Chamberlain, that's Neville Chamberlain, playing a waiting game, perhaps a wise one from his point of view. And it's clear that Donners is going to be a powerful figure as the war comes forward. And indeed, when we reach the Second World War volumes, the references to Donners are rather different. There's not much in The Valley of Bones, which is a volume which takes place during the Phoney War, leading up to the Norwegian campaign and Churchill's assumption of the, oh, we've got Churchill, there he is, becomes Prime Minister in May 1940. This volume is more focused on Jenkins' personal situation, being glad to have been called up, but not in a job that he yet enjoys. And neither does Donners feature predominantly in Soldier's Art, except for his marriage to Matilda. But the references that do appear are clearly positioning him as a future important character. At the end of Valley of Bones, which we're told is the summer of 1940, Germany's invaded the Netherlands. As I say, Churchill is Prime Minister. Jenkins has read in the papers that Sir Magnus has been appointed to the ministerial post for which he had long been tipped. Now, we never find out exactly what that post is, but in real life, we know that Churchill came into office determined to shake things up. His private secretary, Jock Colville, said, Churchill arrived in Downing Street like a jet-propelled rocket, ready to reorganise not only the government, but the whole of the official machine, bringing a number of advisers into Downing Street. There were a few people appointed to Churchill's cabinet who were not professional politicians, most notably, of course, the Lord Beaverbrook, Max Beaverbrook there on the left, who became Minister of Aircraft Production in May 1940 and subsequently Minister of Supply. There's also Brendan Bracken there in the middle, and Frederick Lindemann, later Lord Cherwell, there on the right, the scientific advisor. There's also Desmond Morton, who I'll come back to in a moment. These are all brought in to be personal advisors, Bracken, Lindemann and Morton, to the Prime Minister in various specialist fields. And I think that the character of Donners in Dance is really reflecting aspects of all these figures based on what Powell would have gleaned about them from news coverage and indeed from gossip from his relations and so on, just like Jenkins get it from his wife's relations in Dance. By the time we get to military philosophers, Donners is an important figure. He's a cabinet minister. He has the ear of the Prime Minister. While since late 1941, Jenkins has been working with Colonel Finn, liaising with the Allied governments in exile in London, initially the Poles and later the Belgians and Czechs. Whittenby-Poole, by this time, is a military assistant secretary in the Cabinet Office. And when in mid-April 1942, a very low point in Allied war fortunes, Jenkins attends a meeting in the Cabinet Office on behalf of David Penniston. He meets Templar, who's now working with the Ministry of Economic Warfare. Donners, he says, who continues to be in the cabinet in spite of a concerted attack for several months from certain sections of the press, has probably had a hand in finding Templar his job. And Jenkins also talks to Prince Theodoric, who says, quote, "In knowing Sir Magnus Donners, I am particularly fortunate. He is particularly conversant with our industrial problems and has the ear of a very important person." Now, when Jenkins is promoted and starts working with the Belgians, we're introduced to the new head of the Belgian delegation, Koekeman, pre-war a successful Belgian businessman. Jenkins had imagined him to be rather like Sir Magnus Donners, but he finds he's rather different. And on his first visit to Eaton Square, where the Belgian delegation are, Donner's name comes up. He's been in the headlines on the account of some controversial statement he's made on the subject of manpower. But when Jenkins asks Koekeman if he's seen Donners, Koekeman laughs and says, quote, "A member of your cabinet does not want to be bothered by a major in one of the smaller Allied contingents." Jenkins insists it's worth letting Donners know that Koekeman is now in London. So at this point, I just need to divert a little about the real Koekeman, because it's about the time, after many years of reading these volumes, in the early 2000s, I was writing this book, Churchill's Man of Mystery, a book about Desmond Morton, Churchill's wartime intelligence advisor. Now, Morton had been an artillery officer in the First World War, seriously wounded, and went back as aide-de-camp to General Haig. Although he had a bullet lodged near his heart for the rest of his life. While he was working with Haig, he met Churchill out in the Western Front, and they formed a strong friendship. Morton had been going to be a professional army officer, but because of the bullet near his heart, I'll tell you, when I was researching the book, I spoke to Mary Soames, the late Mary Soames, she remembered Morton when she had been a young girl, watching him playing tennis at Chartwell. And she said she and her friends knew about the bullet in his heart, and they used to watch him playing tennis in the hope he might blow up, which is not very nice, but there we are. Sorry, that's a diversion. Now, so instead of becoming an army officer, Morton, when demobilized, joined the Secret Intelligence Service, later called MI6, as an intelligence officer. And during the 1930s, he became the head of a semi-secret body called the Industrial Intelligence Center, collecting intelligence on economic preparations for war of potential enemies. In the months before the outbreak of the war, Morton was involved in drawing up the plans for what would become the Ministry of Economic Warfare. But he'd remained in touch with Churchill, and when Churchill became Prime Minister, he brought Morton into Number 10 as his personal intelligence advisor, liaising with secret intelligence agencies, but also liaising with governments in exile in London. So one of Morton's jobs was indeed to liaise with the Free French and the Belgians. You can see where dance comes in now. So in Powell's own memoirs, Faces in My Time, he writes about the incident where the Belgian attaché, Baron Paul Kranacher, there's Kranacher on the left, that's the real man, a former Belgian chemist and politician, approached Powell about a plan to bring over to Britain groups of young Belgians who'd been in the resistance and are now causing trouble, vulnerable to communist influence. The Belgian government wants to bring them over to the UK and train them militarily. Now, although Powell agrees this is a good idea, both men think that the bureaucratic obstacles to getting this to happen are really very difficult. Powell has an inspiration. Kranacher should approach Major Morton, quote, universally regarded as a powerful figure, not less so because a certain aura of mystery surrounded his activities. Morton, says Powell, has the PM's ear, and almost immediately the problem is resolved. And of course, this incident is almost identical to the one described in Military Philosophers, when Jenkins advises Kuckerman to approach Sir Magnus Donners, who has the same kind of properties. Now, both in fiction and real life, Jenkins and Powell's immediate superiors are, of course, kept in the dark about this episode of intrigue. Now, I'm going to move on from history now, or I shall talk for too long. So, although the death of Donners is a slightly, we're not quite sure when he died, we've roughly reached the end of his career. So I'm just going to move on to this question of the role of Donners. Now, Donners himself, his company, Donners Brebner, and his home, Starwater, all play an important role in dance as portals to key characters and the interaction between them in providing continuity, important in a 12-novel series, and in moving the plot along. Throughout Dance, details of Donner's life and career provide a useful device to introduce characters while sustaining an air of mystery and complexity in relations to the man himself, right from the very first mention in Question of Upbringing at Silla's Tea Party, and of course with all the other people who come in are met with Donners. An important example, which I've already mentioned, is the crucial episode at Starwater just after the Munich crisis in 1938. Here we get brought together Jenkins and Isabel, Morland and Matilda, but also Peter Templar again, and of course his poor wife Betty, and Umfraville, and indeed later in the evening Widmerpool. Now, although Donner's supposed sexual habits provide the leitmotif for this episode about how he's enjoying watching them enacting the 7 deadly sins, the ground has already been prepared in this volume, The Kindly Ones, with the long opening flashback referring to Jenkins' life before the First World War, and then in the second part where Trelawney is introduced, linking things through to just before the Second World War. So now the Starwater episode sets the scene for global conflict, preparing the ground for a situation in which Donners himself comes to the fore, not so much as a figure of fun in Jenkins' life, but now the supposed man of action. In other words, Donners is symbolic of the development of some kind of a philosophical inquiry on the part of the narrator, Jenkins, as to how one must react to one's changing circumstances in life. A good example of Donners as a portal to key characters is, of course, Matilda in Casanova's Chinese restaurant, when Jenkins and Morland, who are friends, not yet married, Morland takes Jenkins to the theatre to meet the girl he says he wants to marry, and tactlessly Jenkins says, isn't she the jolly laird who was Sir Magnus Donners' mistress? Really, afterwards, he's put his foot in it. Of course, once he gets to know Matilda, Jenkins likes her very much. He's impressed by her, and the two couples, the Morlands and the Jenkins, become good friends. But the references here give us background for Matilda, while also referring again to the supposedly rather louche side of Sir Magnus Donners. Now, of course, Matilda is another very important and recurrent character. And although her marriage to Morland separates her for Donners in one sense, of course, the connection is never lost. And in the end, she goes back to him. Now, in addition to Donners himself, the company he runs, Donners Brebner, I don't think we ever find out who Brebner was. If anybody knows, you can tell me afterwards. But the company is important for the start because it's a useful plot device, as so many Dance characters are involved with it, both directly and indirectly. In question of upbringing, Bill Truscott's already working there. Charles Stringham is enticed to leave university to work there, and Widmerpool soon joins in as well. Donners Brebner is particularly important in charting Widmerpool's career and indicating his ambition and ruthlessness. In Buyer's Market, Widmerpool tells Jenkins, when dining with his mother, that he's had an important move up at Donners Brebner, and that Stringham is leaving. Perhaps that's a good thing, said Widmerpool. This short conversation gives a lot of useful information about the career trajectory of Widmerpool, but also about Stringham, who, not for the last time, is removed from a position, university, Donners Brebner, marriage with Peggy Stepney, even later on the army, to avoid embarrassment. In the acceptance world, we learn that having apparently been instrumental in getting both Truscott and Stringham sacked, Widmerpool has himself left Donners Brebner to join the acceptance world as a bill broker. Templar tells Jenkins when they meet at the Ritz that actually after sacking Truscott, Donners regretted it and thought Widmerpool was getting too big for his boots. But actually it turns out that Donners has not broken with Widmerpool after all, but is using him in certain aspects of Donners Brebner business, including dealing with awkward characters such as Bob Duport, who of course also is important. And in Casanova's Chinese restaurant, Widmerpool tells Jenkins that he's accepted the commission of advising Donners Brebner regarding the investment of funds for their pension scheme. Widmerpool says Sir Magnus, in general, an excellent man of business, is sometimes surprisingly hesitant in matters of policy. But from this, what we learn really is that Donners knows perfectly well what Widmerpool is like and how he should use him, which is to draw on his expertise and ruthlessness without working too closely with him. I can't go through all the references, but it's worth mentioning the episode in Kindly Ones when Jenkins meets Bob Duport while burying Uncle Giles at Albert's Hotel in the seaside. Duport complains that Widmerpool caused him to lose his job and his money, but he still has to admit that Widmerpool has in fact assessed the European situation accurately. And later, in The Military Philosophers, when Jenkins meets Duport in Brussels, the Donners Brebner connection comes in again because Duport explains that he had a chance of going to Egypt for a firm that wanted to wind up one of their branches. Donners arranged for him to go and indeed got him out so that he could join the army. Widmerpool's connection with Donners throughout also creates a continuity with Jenkins' own military career. Of course, he goes to see Widmerpool in the vain hope that he might help him get called up. And then Jenkins asks if Donners will be asked to join the government. This is at the beginning of the war. And now Widmerpool is now rather condescending about Donners. In some ways, he would make an excellent minister in time of war. In others, I'm not so sure. And of course, there's the encounter with when he's training between Jenkins and Jimmy Brent on a training course, when he learns uncomfortable details about Brent's affair with Jean Duport. And Brent talks about how Donners had helped Peter Templar get an advisory job with the government. Another key point, a connection with Donners Brevner, is, of course, the literary prize introduced by Matilda after Donner's death. And in Hearing Secret Harmonies, we learn that in the early days of her widowhood, she'd sort of let it drop. But she then decides she wants to memorialize Donners and set up this literary prize. This is a very useful plot device because by Jenkins, the prize and Jenkins' inclusion on the judging panel provides multiple links to previous characters like Russell Gwinnett, Emily Brightman, to X-Trapnell, to Gibson de la Vacquerie, to the Quiggins, and indeed, of course, to Pamela Widmerpool, and, of course, especially to Widmerpool himself, whose speech at the prize-giving dinner provides a horrifying foretaste of his final disintegration. During his speech, Widmerpool criticises Donners as representing in public life, quote, all that I most abhor, all that I hold most pernicious, characterised Donners and his doings in many different ways. Nevertheless, admits Widmerpool, Donners put me in charge many years ago of the sources from which the monies derive that's going to pay this prize. And I think this, in a way, rather sums up what Jenkins himself feels about. You know, we don't like Donners, we don't like the sort of person he was, we don't like what he did, but he still has used his money to good effect in the arts in particular. Finally, a little word about Starwater, described in Buyer's Market by Sir Gavin Walpole Wilson as rather too perfect for my taste. Jenkins himself is rather impressed on his first visit. Here, quote, was the Middle Ages, from the pages of Tennyson or Scott, at its most elegant, sordid and painful elements subtly removed. Nevertheless, Jenkins is quick to criticise, comparing Starwater to a Hollywood film set. The impression, he says, was of sensations that might precede one of those episodes in a fairy story, where at a given moment fountains and pleasure gardens disappear into thin air. Shown round the castle, Jenkins fancies that at some wave of the wand, somewhat in the manner of Peer Gynt, furniture and armour, pictures and hangings, gold and silver, crystal and china, could turn easily and instantaneously into a heap of withered leaves. Now, later, during the war, when Jenkins is on a course at Castle Malloch, he compares Castle Malloch to Starwater. But the place is important because it's a scene where elaborate and significant scenes are staged. There was always with Donners, with constant undertones to questionable aspects of his character. And of course, to his, regarded as poor taste, his fondness for showing people, especially young women, the dungeons, his appearance through a secret door in Kindly Ones, and his enjoyment, of course, of the enactment of the Seven Deadly Sins. Of course, Starwater is also the scene of Jenkins' meeting with Jean Duport, where they look at the tapestries, the announcement of Stringham's engagement to Penny Stepney, and for the appearance of Widmerpool, both in Buyer's Market and later in Kindly Ones, not as a guest, but as a sort of apparition, coming in and reminding everybody that Donners is, in fact, an important man with important business to do. So even after Donners and indeed Matilda are dead, Starwater is still a key location. In particular, the setting for what might be called the final act of dance, the Cutts' wedding in Hearing Secret Harmonies. Here are brought together a wide range of figures from across the whole series of novels, including Stringham's sister Flavia, Bithell from Wartime Days, and Sir Bertram Ackworth, who'd been at school with Jenkins and to whom Widmerpool now apologises in accordance with the strictures of the cult run by Murtlock. Now, even though Donners is no more, Jenkins can't resist, even now, having a dig at him by noting of Ackworth that, quote, in failing to acquire a great deal of outward distinction, he resembled Sir Magnus Donners, a man of greater abilities in the same line. Sir Bertram Ackworth showed, anyway at long range, no sign of projecting Sir Magnus's air of being nevertheless a little disturbing. So in short, I would argue that Donners, Starwater, and of course Donners Brevner all draw the strands of dance together, perhaps a fitting testament to his importance as a character. And my last slide is a rather typical Jenkins quote about Donners, which I think is rather disingenuous. I'm sorry if I've talked for too long, but I'm going to stop now in case anybody wants to answer any questions. Thank you. I shall stop sharing my screen, Keith.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much, Jill. That's very interesting survey of Donners, which, some of which I'd not appreciated myself. I certainly had not, although I'd picked up an antipathy towards Donners throughout, I'd certainly not picked up the strength that you seem to feel Jenkins has towards Donners. So that's interesting. Okay, questions, comments, anybody? If you can put your hand up, use the raise your hand. Anything? Anybody? Nobody? John Blackster.
I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed, Jill. I found that very interesting because he's somebody that I've never really found that I could sort of get a grip on. And that maybe
I think that's what Powell thought too, or rather Jenkins feels.
Yeah. I don't know if that's because of my lack of sort of sophistication, but I preferred characters who are slightly more rumbustious, like, I don't know, Edgar Deacon and so on and so forth. But I think you did also manage to convey the idea of being this sort of parallel world, almost the sort of the worldliness of Sir Magnus Donners, and also I like the idea of Stourwater being not quite a Camelot, but something like a sort of centre of those sorts of activities. And I enjoyed it greatly, and I wasn't sure if I would or not. Sorry about that.
That's quite all right.
I mean, somewhere I have a memory that Jenkins or somebody refers to Stourwater as it being a cardboard cutout.
Yeah, that's Isabel.
I think that's Isabel.
Yeah.
Is it right? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, John. Paul Milliken.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jill. The point you make about Donners being difficult to get a grasp of, I was reminded that the Mark Boxer caricature on the front of the dance volume shows a bull-necked man of obvious physical presence, something possibly a Cecil Rhodes or Robert Maxwell or somebody like that. And yet, in the TV version, which you haven't seen, Richard Pascoe portrayed him as a rather bland, sort of anonymous figure,
which I think fits in more with what's written. I don't. I mean, in a way, that picture I showed of Beaverbrook, he's more of that kind of physical type. But the descriptions of Donners throughout dance are not like that at all. He's always quite thin, quite sort of clean shaven, rather nondescript, not powerful looking at all.
And I think the key to that is the fact that AP, of course, Nick Jenkins would not have seen Donners in his element. Now, I work for Royal Dutch Shell, so I saw some very powerful Donners-like characters operating within the company. And they were very different within the company to how they appeared outside. Outside, they were very keen to be bland, uncontroversial, almost nonentities in a way.
Yeah.
Very careful to sort of wrap themselves around with the carapace that couldn't really be touched. But inside the company, they were very different.
I think that's a really good point.
I think that speaks to the sort of the Nick Jenkins view, looking at him in a kind of a social situation, not knowing him in a business situation. That would be my comment on that. Thank you.
Indeed. I mean, at a somewhat lower level, I've seen the same thing. John Rowe. You're on mute, John.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. I thought that was excellent, Jill. You brought together quite a lot of what is lying behind the Donners portrayal. And it really did have absolute conviction. By the way, so thank you so much for that. By the way, I thought Richard Pascoe, I did see it. I thought he was far too good looking for Donners, really.
Yeah.
maybe that sort of brings out the enigma you handle him, because you're right. He's a much flatter person. My question, though, for you is, you said a couple of times as you went through Jenkins's reaction to Donners that he's very censorious. He wants to distance himself from him while finding the compulsion, as you say, the whole power of Donners and all of that stuff, which Jenkins disapproves of but finds fascinating. But the thing that I often found odd about the portrayal of Donners is the voyeurism, which you did mention. And I do feel that Jenkins himself is prone to voyeurism.
Right.
And I think also perhaps Powell is a bit of a voyeur.
Perhaps, I mean, novelists often are, in a sense, I suppose you could say.
Sorry.
Novelists, you might think, have that kind of tendency because they're looking behind people all the time.
I think, yes, absolutely. But I do feel that I mean, one of Powell's favorite chaps of the 17th century is that terrible old gossip, John Aubrey, isn't he?
Yes.
He was a voyeur, if anybody.
Yeah.
Always looking for the salacious. And I just find that is what comes through as one of the aspects in Donners. And my question really is whether this is Powell letting go of a bit of his own. I'm saying Powell here, not Jenkins. Powell, letting go of a bit of his own voyeurism into the mix through Donners.
Well, I mean, I don't know, but of course that's, I'm not saying that's impossible. But what really struck me, as I mentioned, is that, when he talks about some of the really rather nasty things that Dr. Trelawney has done, for example, and other characters, even some of the things that Uncle Giles has done, he's quite indulgent of that. He doesn't, whereas with Donners, he's always rather censorious. Now, you're right, that maybe is an indication of Powell's own tendencies or his own interests, and he doesn't want to explore that too closely. I really wouldn't know. But I was reading it all again for preparing this talk. I kept looking at these older men. Even, for example, little things like when General Conyers is a lot of people criticize him for marrying Miss Wheaton, and so on, and all the various shenanigans that people get up to. Jenkins is quite indulgent about that, but he's never indulgent about Donners. So if that indicates his own personal preferences, possibly, but I can't say I know that. And I'm not sure that the biography that Hilary Spelling's really gives you that impression.
You mean Powell's own biography?
Yeah.
Yes. No, it doesn't. I agree with you.
That's interesting because my view, following on from that, and I've not thought this through, is that, as you've implied, John and Gill, that Dance really is from start to finish voyeuristic, much more so in a way than many other novels, I think, because Jenkins is always looking behind people, at what motivates them, things that are going on that he may or may not see, and so on and so on. Yeah, that's it. It's an interesting thought. Yeah. Elwyn.
Got it. No, thank you, Gill. Very interesting talk. On a much underappreciated character. One thing from my point of view, at a much more superficial level, but something that's always interesting, is sort of where does the name come from? I mean, Donners, which to me is a very credible name that's chosen for the character, and I think that the way a writer chooses a name, of course, is actually of great importance. And I've always thought that he takes this name Donners of the industrialist from Brunner-Mond as a mashup of those two names. Brunner-Mond being this chemical company founded in the 1870s. Well, obviously subsequently becomes an important part, or one of the main parts of ICI. I mean, just Googling it up, I mean, and Brunner himself dies in 1919. The ICI merges in 2026. Powell would evidently have been familiar with that name of a company.
That's a good point. I think you're quite possibly right. It's a kind of amalgam of that. I mean, that
you've
one.
Got the Mond, haven't you? Donners and the Brunner, and also who was Brebner? Well, of course, in Brunner Mond, of course, Brunner was the businessman, the public figure, the member of parliament. Mond was the chemist. So I take it that Brebner is the mysterious metallurgist.
Well, we never hear who really who Brebner is. No,
without whose patents it would never function. And that anyway, that's a thought on it.
No, that's an interesting point. I don't know whether but I think you're absolutely right. It's quite likely that that's where he got the name from, really. And
maybe not deliberately, but just it's sort of in the back of his mind somewhere.
It has a good ring, as
it does.
Sometimes there's this phrase that somebody used, the great industrialist, rather facetiously.
Correct.
Donners has a strong it has a strong commercial kind of sound to it. I agree.
And that's actually the thing that distinguishes him from all the other businessmen, the Templars, Duport, Widmanpool, and so forth. He's actually an industrialist. There's at the head of a concern making something. And he's the sort of person that my real life Desmond Morton, the sort of person that he had a lot of dealings with in the late 1930s, when the Secret Intelligence Service used people like not so much the heads of those companies, but representatives of companies like BP. Well, it wasn't BP then, but and other big industrial, because those, until the war actually breaks out, those industrial organizations are quite free to be sending people around Europe, including into Germany, and looking at what the sort of wartime preparations. And Morton's organization was collecting intelligence from those kind of people. So Morton would certainly have known the real Donners. Yes.
Yeah. John Walters.
Yes, thank you very much, Gill, for a fascinating historian's perspective on Magnus Donners. What's occurred to me listening to this discussion is that a powerful man like Sir Magnus Donners, an industrialist, plays a role that's almost like a rival to the novelist, in that he connects lots of people merely by being powerful and in charge of companies for which people work, and bestowing commissions on artists, musicians, and so on. And that's absolutely true in our lives, certainly in my lives. I've worked for, either as employee or freelance, for companies owned by Robert Maxwell, Michael Heseltine, Richard Branson, and you occasionally come into contact with these very powerful people, and they have a certain magnetism. Sometimes, in the case of Maxwell, you have a horror, which is borne out by what they did later. I mean, Jimmy Savile. I had a brief encounter with Jimmy Savile and thought he was a very nasty piece of work. And I think that what Powell encapsulates very well in his distaste for Donners, which you've described so well, is this feeling that these men really don't deserve to have so much power, but they do, and we can't help it. And I have very good friends who I've only met because we were both doing something for a studio owned by Richard Branson, and then had a very brief encounter where I could see Branson using his privilege to play schoolboyish pranks upon fairly junior employees. So I think that this is a real, I think Powell's reflected something that really does happen. And now in the present day, it's almost it's horrifyingly relevant, because we're seeing the malign actions of people like Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI, Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein. That we're seeing evidence that power corrupts absolutely. And although Magnus Donners is a more ambiguous character, these little hints at his voyeurism, his exploitation of very young girls and women, sort of lurks around
Yeah.
the
I
descriptions
think
of him.
in a way it's a bit unfair to Donners because we never get any hard evidence of him of corruption or sort of with his business dealings and so on. Indeed, one of the things I think that Jenkins or perhaps Powell struggles with throughout is it precisely that, is how to reckon with this man, because he really dislikes him and he wants to think of him as a villain, and yet Donners does things like he commissions Barnby he helps Barnby by commissioning murals, he helps Morland by commissioning music, he gives away a lot of money, so rather reluctantly Jenkins, but he can't like him.
No, well, I think he's in that way he's probably more like Richard Branson than Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah. I don't think I see Donners as Richard Branson.
But
Nice
I mean, a very rich man
I
can do a lot of good just merely by bestowing, cash on deserving
and
artists
patronage.
and institutions.
Paul.
Yeah, I've just dipped into Hilary Spurling's invitation to the dance, just to remind myself what she says about him.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting, actually. Middle 50s, but looks at least 10 years younger. Tallish, good looking, rather than the reverse.
Yeah.
Patron of the arts.
Yeah.
Patron of Barnby, patron of Morland, fond of Parsifal, blah blah blah. And even after the war, he looks no older after the war. So it's interesting, isn't it? We're struggling to kind of pin a kind of persona on him. We're sort of veering from one end to the other. So I think that comes back to your point of how sort of ambiguous a figure he is. The other point I'd mention about the name, I think Elwyn's bang on about the derivation of the Donners name. Brebner, by the way, there is a Brebner.com webpage for the Brebner family, and it's South African, Scottish stroke South African, and I think that's where potentially the metals type trading aspect comes in. So it's a long established name with the Scottish South African linkage.
No,
thank you very much. Thank you.
No, I mean, I still think in the end that what Donners provides in dance more than anything is continuity. I mean, he's there in every volume, and it's a continuity of with Jenkins. He's the sort of the branch with all these different characters and plots and things going off the side, and I think he's really important for that. But I think, as everybody's been saying, Jenkins and Powell can never really quite decide what he thinks about Donners. And I suspect that was true of what Powell thought about certain real life figures. And a lot of other people thought about people like Max Beaverbrook, for example, who made an awful lot of enemies.
Yeah.
Or indeed Desmond Morton, he made a lot of enemies too. But he was the secret squirrel.
Alf, you're on mute.
Yes. One of AP's contacts with the business world was the MP Davignor Goldsmith. I don't know whether there's anything. I don't know much about him, but what little I've heard, he seemed quite a nice man. So perhaps he wasn't much of a model for Magnus Donners.
No, but I think, I mean, there's that, but also through through Violet and Violet's extensive family, rather like Jenkins in dance, Powell would have met a very wide variety of people with connections with business and politics as well as with other things. So I'm sure he had come across people who had dealings in these kind of enterprises.
Someone referred to where did AP get the language of the business world or of the markets, which he uses, when Widmerpool turns up.
From Davignor Goldsmith.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. No, I mean, Powell says that himself somewhere.
Yeah.
He used David L. Goldsmith as a sort of consultant almost. Okay, anything else from anybody? We're just over the hour, so
I just asked that question whether Donners was a man without friends and that Nick Jenkins valued friendship between people. And with
you never
Donners,
hear about Donners having friends, do you? No.
it seems like his relationships were transactional.
Yeah,
And they,
a patronage, really. Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. He's actually quite a private person. I mean, even his relationships with these series of girlfriends before he marries, but I mean, it's all fairly. He likes being seen with beautiful young women. You never get the impression that he really enters into a close emotional relationship with them.
John Rowe.
It's Christine, actually.
Oh, Christine, sorry.
Just to go back to the name Donners, in German, Donnerwetter is thunder. You know, it's so I have always thought of Donners as thunder in some way.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting.
Powerful, but you know, you can hear it, but you can't see it. You can't pin it down. Anyway, that's my point. That's all.
Like it. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Anything else? Or should we wrap up and go and have another glass of wine?
Well, thank you all for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Gill. Thank you. I noticed that we have neither the current secretary nor chairman with us tonight, but John Blackster, Robin, any sort of last thoughts and announcements or anything to come through?
Yes, nothing to do. Is that okay? Unmuted? Yeah.
Yeah, you're okay.
Nothing to do with tonight, but the John Albury weekend, we should be able. I've been away for a couple of weeks. And I've had other difficulties of one sort or another, but I'm hoping to have a roundup tomorrow and sort out some details and then put it out to everybody. And that's the second week in September the 12th, I think we've got around that
Excellent.
weekend. So if you want to look out for that,
thank you.
Should be in the next few days.
Thank you, John. That's good. Robin, was there anything from you?
Nothing from me.
No. Okay. The next one of these talks in a month's time, Wednesday, 13th of May, same time, with Chairman Bernard Stacey talking about Dan Tokenhouse, which should be very, very interesting, I think. And our next sort of open social call, which ties in with the release of the newsletter, is Saturday the 20th of June, midday UK time. Book, if you want to attend those, please via the website. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you, Jill.
No, see everybody again soon.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.